So our discussion for today is about the next level of the next level of organization in terms of ecology. So as after population, you have several sets of population that are interacting with each other within a geographical range is termed as community. So this is actually the first part of the discussion in community ecology, since there are several subtopics and these subtopics are divided into different lectures. So in this um, in this discussion, we are going to include the general views of community ecology, the definition, and the scope of ecology, or community ecology, should I say, and the different components of community ecology, which constitutes generally species diversity, um, with different populations, what are the factors affecting community structure, the foundation and keystone species, what are the difference between the two, how are these two types of species or species classification important in the structure of community, and of course we have also community change and stability, which focuses on what we so call the process of ecological succession. So, community ecology, as defined or generally defined, is a study of the distribution, abundance, demography, and interaction between coexisting population. So, aside from this type of definition, um, the ecological community is also the set of plant and animal species that occupy an area. Okay, so most probably this is actually the structure. However, we cannot deny the fact that this ecological community of plants and animal species are also interacting with each other. So it's not just the components of the ecological community within a specific geographical range, but also the interaction between these organisms are also included in what we so-called community ecology. So, a broad definition of community ecology is a group of species that occupy a given area, interacting either directly and indirectly. So, this particular definition is actually the spatial concept. So, spatial concept, which includes the interaction of the different groups of species or different populations. So, in some or most of the references, they have actually enumerated some of the components of um, community. So that includes the number of species, okay? So that represents species richness, the relative abundance of species. So we will discuss that one. The nature of species interaction. So what are the different root causes of the different interactions in the population? So we have already discussed different species interaction in population ecology. So there are instances that we might encounter that one in our next, in the next few slides. Okay, ayan. Okay. So community ecology has two general views. We have the individualistic hypothesis, which is established by Gleason, and you have the interactive hypothesis by Clemens. Okay, so in individualistic hypothesis, a community is a chance assemblage of species found in an area because they have similar environmental requirements. So, ibig sabihin, technically, if you were try to um, reiterate this one, or you will try to explain this one in layman's term. So the community exists in a given specific area because they are adapted to environmental condition of such area. So for example, if you have a desert or savanna ecosystem just like this, so most probably the community of plants here are adapted to that conditions, and they have this different adaptations in order for them to survive in that specific environmental condition. So in the Gleason, in the perception of Gleason, uh, The community is an arbitrary concept and stated that each species responds independently to the underlying features of the environment. So, the hypothesis or this particular view gives us the idea that a community is dependent on the present environmental condition, which is very true, okay, since the interaction as well as the components of the environment literally define the number of or the different species or different populations that exist in a specific community. In the case of Clement's view in the interactive hypothesis, a community is an assemblage of closely linked species having mandatory biotic interactions that cause the community to function as an integrated unit called, which he calls it, or a superorganism. So Clemens viewed the communities as a quasi-organism made up of interdependent species. So ibig sabihin, the existence of the different populations has something to do with the existence of the different other populations also. So, different populations exist in a community because they are dependent with each other. Yun ang view ni Clemens. So, kaya nga siya na tinawag na interactive hypothesis. It is because they are interacting with each other. And that interaction is actually synonymously viewed by Clemens as interdependence. Okay? So their existence is important to the existence of others. So yun yung view ni Clemens. So in community ecology, we have also what we so called community structure. So it is essentially the composition of community, including the number of species in that community and their respective numbers. And that number is actually referring to the relative abundance. So, relative abundance represents the percentage of each species contributing to the total number of individual of all species. So what will be the percentage of that particular number of species to the whole total number of species within the community? That is relative abundance. We will have further background of relative abundance when you conduct the laboratory that is related to this topic. Okay, so I'll be uploading that one. It can also be interpreted more broadly to include all of the patterns of interaction between these different species. So the different species as well as different interactions shapes what we so called community structure. So community structure has stratification, species diversity, species richness, ecological structure, and edge effects. So these are some of the important terms that are or related to community structure. For example, if you look for stratification for community, sa community meron tinatawag na zonation or spatial zonation. So, ibig sabihin, in this particular zone, if you have one zone, for example, this is a tropical rainforest, and you go down to lower altitude, meron namang grassland, for example. So these are zonation. So that is very dependent on the environmental condition. That is when you look into horizontal stratification. But we have also what we so called vertical stratification. For example, if you are in a forest, there are different vertical structures sa forest. Meron kang tinatawag na canopy, meron kang tinatawag na understory, at meron tinatawag na ground level. So meron tinatawag na canopy plants. Actually, meron pang isa dito. You have the emergent structures or emergent level. So yung mga trees na nag-emerge because of its unique height, yung medyo mataas na. Ayan. So that includes emergent. You have canopy, yung dense crown cover ng mga trees. And you have understory at this level, medyo medium height na plants. And you have the ground level, yung nasa baba, which covers the ground. So these stratification of different communities are also included in community structure. So that is stratification. We have also species diversity. We have discussed this already, but we will discuss more in the previous slides. That includes the number of species, okay, diversity, species diversity is a function of the number of species as well as the distribution and the number or abundance of these species. So that um, represents species diversity. Species richness, technically, that is the number of species, okay, present in a community. You have niche structure, so the habitat as well as the role of the organism in a particular community. So there are different roles of organisms or population within the community, so that is or that constitutes to um, community structure. You have edge effects also. So we have discussed already the zonation. So that zonation actually creates what we so called the edge. So ibig sabihin, if you have a particular community from forest, for example, then the next zone is grassland. So the boundary between that forest and the grassland is actually the edge. So there are certain species that are very abundant or that um, inhabit that particular boundary. So there are some instances that there are high diversity in the edge or the boundaries of two different communities. Okay? So tinatawag yung edge effect. So there are certain environmental conditions in that particular boundaries. So some instances na pwede mag-favor ng diversity. So that is what we so-called edge effect. So community structure also involve the interactions. So in this case, this particular interaction is something to do with the feeding relations. So um, the feeding guilds, ano yung kinakain ng ano. So we have the food trophic levels or the food ecological food pyramid, and you have the food web. So we will discuss this one on the next part of this discussion. But this is just to represent that the interaction between the species, which is included in the community structure. So species diversity is a measure of community complexity that is due to the number of species. Okay, so it is a function of both number of different species, that's species richness, and their relative abundances or species evenness and numbers. Okay, or the number of individuals. Yan. So that constitutes species diversity. Hindi lang po siya number of species, but the two, or the combination of the two constitutes the species diversity of a particular community. Okay. So for example, if you have a forest community with 20 different kinds of trees would have greater species diversity than of the forest community, given that their abundance or even their abundance is even in both cases. Okay? So that is an example of species diversity. For example, if you are looking into tropical rainforest and the boreal forest or coniferous forest, so we will have the idea that tropical rainforest constitutes a large number of species and even its distribution or abundance as compared to coniferous forest. It is because you have already the idea from the term of the or the name of the forest itself. It is dominated by different conifers only. Okay, and there are only few ground species for this particular forest. So most likely, tropical rainforest has greater diversity compared to coniferous forest. Kasi coniferous forests are or constitutes or is a habitat for plants or trees that are adapted to winter condition or cold condition. Ito naman, napakaraming because of high precipitation rate and even the relative humidity. Okay. So what are the factors that shapes community structures? First, we have the climatic patterns of the community. Okay. So climatic we usually um, relate this one to the environmental condition. So in the climatic patterns, dalawang bagay ang tinitingnan natin. We have the global climate patterns and we have the local climate patterns. So for the global climate patterns, we look into the variation in temperature, solar energy input, and distance from the equator. So these actually is the larger in a larger scale. Okay, so these different variations in temperature, solar energy, and the distance from equator actually creates determines the type of community that is located within the area. As you go far from the equator, yung mga ganon, so nag-change ang solar energy, nag-change ang temperature. So that actually shapes the type of community. So most probably, if you're near in the equator, you have tropical rainforest, so there are diverse community structure. Okay, we have also local climate patterns or effects created by mountain range. So within a particular geographic range may mountain. Okay, so yung for example the rain shadow effect. Okay, yung one side lang ng mountain ang uh, nagkakaroon ng precipitation and the rest wala na. So that is one of the example of local climate effects. So bodies of water and streams, so they are separated by bodies of water. So most likely will create that will create a barrier, for example. So nag-isolate ngayon yung organisms from one place to another. So nagkakaiba yung composition kumbaga, which the composition itself determines the shape of the community structure. So pwedeng ganun ang mangyari. So the geography of the community's location. So geographical features of an area affects community structure. For example, if you have an island communities that is farther or nearer from the mainland. So island communities that are farther away from the mainland tend to have small number of species than those that are closer to the mainland. That is because of the distance, okay, traveling or moving from the island to the mainland. Okay, so mas easier sa some species na mag-travel doon sa island na malapit sa mainland than sa island na malayo sa mainland. Okay, so that is the geographical features. Yan. So for number 3, the heterogeneity or patchiness of the environment. So if there's more variation in the community's environment, this may allow for greater species richness because these are more distinct habitats to be occupied. Yan. So ibig sabihin, although a community is determined by specific environmental conditions, but these within this particular community, there are patches. We have also microclimate, for example. So there are different patches of vegetation, for example, patches of different microclimates. So these variations in microclimates creates higher number of species richness that's adapted to specific microclimates. So that constitutes different microclimates. Okay, the heterogeneity of microclimates within a specific community uh, gives or enhances species diversity. It is because there are different species that are adapted to different microclimates. So ayun. So that's heterogeneity. Okay? So for number 4, the frequency of the disturbances or disruptive events. Yan yung tinatawag na intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So the frequency of disruptive event like storms, wildfire, should I say, landslide, or these are natural phenomenon, can affect the community structure. So in the intermediate disturbance hypothesis suggests that communities with a medium or intermediate level of disturbance may have greater species diversity than communities with very frequent or rare disturbances. So that is related to resiliency of community. So for example, if less frequent or very rare ang disturbance, medyo bumababa kasi yung resiliency ng community in terms of um, regenerating back. Okay? So since they are not used to any disturbance at all, very rare, so parang it is not it is very unusual for that particular community to have different disturbances. So mahihirapan sila ngayong mag-generate kung merong disturbance na regenerate kung merong disturbance na magdating. Yung very frequent naman, yung disturbances, so regeneration of a particular community happens for a longer period of time. It is not abrupt but gradual. So kung paulit ng paulit na magyayari yung disturbance, mahihirapan ngayong mag-regenerate ang community. Okay? So, yan yung nakaka-apekto din. So, as compared to if you have intermediate or medium level na disturbances, parang there is a time for that particular community to regenerate. Okay? So, mas maigi yon than very rare and very frequent. In between, or very medium level na disturbance, yun yung best for a community to have a larger number of species diversity or greater species diversity should I say. Okay, so another factor is the interaction between organisms. So we have mutualism, commensalism, uh, parasitism, you have predation, kumbaga. So for example, if you have a competition interaction, so two species that compete um, intensively with one another may be unavailable or unable to coexist. That is the competitive exclusion principle in the same community. So a prey species may be unable to persist if a community that contains a highly effective predation. Okay, so very high rate of predation. So mahihirapang mag-generate or mag-regenerate ng kanyang number of individuals itong population ng prey. So pwedeng ganun ang mangyayari. So ibig sabihin, the community will just a high number of predators than the prey. So pwedeng maapektuhan din yung population ng predator. If you have a competition, one will move out from the community and the other one will persist. Okay? So that different interactions with species shapes the community. Okay? So makikita lang naman natin yung difference if we look onto competition and predation kasi most likely they have negative impacts to one population or one organism. But in commensalism, in mutualism, wala naman. Okay? So they both mutualism enhances both population while commensalism enhances the other walang effect. Okay, so those different interactions na discuss natin in population ecology has something to do in shaping the community structure.